All right. Um, I am going to talk today about capitalism and slavery and make some further connections. This is part two of the lecture series on chapter 9 materials, chapter 8 materials, sorry, chapter 8 materials. I will have a concluding bit of material on Friday, and then I'll post a quiz. But today is Wednesday afternoon, and I want to finish up some of the remarks that I was making on Monday that I posted Monday night, and that hopefully you've already had a chance to look at. So this is part two of the lecture on capitalism and slavery. And my point here is to try to make the connection between the ways in which slavery underwrote the development of American industrial society and the development of American capitalism. I also want you to see how the slave labor camps, aka plantations, were very much like factories in some fundamental ways. So let us do this. Let me share my application and screen, and let's get started. So the title of this particular lecture is Capitalism and Slavery in America, Part 2, Enslaved as Capital. And I want you to think about enslaved laborers in a very different way than I think you normally do. We don't often think of, I think everybody knows that slaves were property, that people were held as property, but what exactly does that mean? What does that imply? And so when we think of enslaved laborers as property rather than as labor, we then start to think about them in a different fashion. And we also can see how they as property generate wealth for those who own them in other ways than simply by doing work for them. And I think you need to, above all, think of them as property. Think of enslaved people as property. The most, the most profitable and the most significant form of property that was held in the 19th century, particularly in the South, but actually in the entirety of the United States. The bodies of enslaved people were valuable. It wasn't just their labor that was valuable; their bodies themselves were valuable. And in fact, in many cases, they were an enslaved person was the most valuable person or most valuable property that a plantation owner or a slave owner had. In document 5, there is a table that I would encourage you to look at that shows the average price of an enslaved person um, and illustrates the gradual increase in the price of a slave between 1803 and 1860. This particular document, let me make sure I didn't put this on here. Oh yes, I did, right here. So here we see the average price of a slave from 1804 to 1861 in current dollars, and current dollars means in the currency of that period. So in 1804, the average price of an enslaved person, this is an average, it's not what you would typically get for a healthy male enslaved man between the age of 18 and 35 or 40, that price would be substantially higher. But we're talking here about the average price of slaves as they were put on the market from the age of, as sometimes as young as 6 weeks old, all the way up to 70 or 80. And obviously, you're going to see a range of prices that one could expect for an enslaved person of certain age, physical capabilities, et cetera, et cetera. I'd hate to get too much into this because I don't really like the idea of thinking about enslaved people as commodities or human beings as commodities, but it's impossible to escape that reality. And so here we see what happens in the course of the 19th century, kind of gradual increase in the price of enslaved people over the course of this period. Now, what that reflects are ups and downs, as you can see, and that reflects sort of the downturns in the economy or the increasing demand for cotton in at particular high points in the 19th century. But there is a gradual and kind of increasing growth in the value and price of slaves that you see over the long haul here in that 50-year period, plus or minus. Now, document 6 provides us a different kind of comparison, and this is how this is based on the consumer price index, and I have this in 2015 dollars. I haven't done a comparable calculation. That was when I produced this reader in 2016, 2017. So, but you can see the same basic secular trend of an upward increase in the price of a slave. In 2015 dollars, we see the average price of an enslaved person was about $5,000 in 1804 in 2015 dollars, and it rose to about 20,000 in 1860 or thereabouts. So in fact, it's about $24,000 in 2015 terms. So this gives you a sense of about what the at least the based on the consumer price index, which is not the best value, not the best way to measure this. It's probably one of the more inaccurate ways to measure what our value, what the current value of an enslaved person was in our terms, in our dollars. So keep in mind that these are average prices, and that prices for physically fit working age male or female slaves would be much higher than the average would be for children, the elderly, or the infirm, and so forth. And in looking at these documents, you can see the growing value of it. Now, if you look at document 7, which I didn't post because it's too long a document, look at document 7, and that is a tax appraisal record. And in a tax appraisal, what the tax assessor does is he comes and looks at the value of one's house, looks at the value of other property that you may own, and then makes a judgment as to how much you should be taxed on your property. And so in this case here, you can see the very different prices that would be associated with with different individuals of different ages, right? So, for example, in document 7, there is a 6-year-old boy named Tawny who is valued at $100, and a 20-year-old male by the name of Joshua who's valued at $400. You can also look and see some things about the average assessed value of women, say, for example, in their childbearing years, and you can compare that to women in their 40s or older, and you can see how the value of a woman in her childbearing peak years is quite a bit more than for someone who's already past their prime childbearing ages, and that tells you what the enslavers, plantation owners, considered to be their one of the sources of value for an enslaved woman. One of the measures of the significance of the enslaved can be seen in another document. Let's see, I'm going to jump out of this one. This is not where I wanted to go. Go back to this source. In document 13, there is an assessment of the value of slaves in 1855 in Texas. And by comparison to the value of the enslaved in Texas, the value of land, there's only about $5 million more in land value in the state of Texas in 1855 than there was in the value of enslaved people. The total value of the slaves held in Texas in 1855 was about $53 million. The total value of the enslaved in the South as a whole, according to one source that I've recently read, measured at that time, was about $4 billion, which is a substantial amount of money in today's terms, which you need to keep in mind. Now, by comparison, the total value of land in Texas was only about $58 million, plus or minus. So by comparison to the most important sources of value in Texas: livestock, merchandise, bank savings, house stocks, etc. The value of the enslaved was much greater. So look at document 13, and you can see the wealth estimate for Texas and its property value, and you can see the prominence that slaveholding had in the wealth of the state of Texas. Now, looking at the United States as a whole, and this is 1860, um, we can see how the U.S. Census estimated the value of total property in the country, and the enslaved were of about $3 billion. Now that is based on the census account. One of the Confederate cabinet members in 1860 estimated that it was about four billion. It's difficult to say, but by comparison to the value of the total property in the United States, the enslaved represented um, almost what 10% plus or minus. Yeah, more than that actually, more than that. Um, my math skills are pretty bad on the fly. But anyhow, you can see someone do the math on this. um, you can see that by comparison to the farmland, which is the single most important other um, property value in the United States, the value of farms about 6.6 billion dollars. And a lot of the value of those farms was also tied into the value of the enslaved, as we'll see here in a second. By comparison, railroads, which you often think of this as the age of railroad building, quite a bit smaller in value than the value of slaves. The total amount of bank capital, finance capital, so much less than the value of slaves. Home productions, livestock, you can see that the value of property and wealth in the United States, slaves were the second most profitable source of property, most valuable source of property in 1860. So this is one of the things I wanted to kind of emphasize, that property as property, they are very, very important. Now, one of the characteristic features of property in any capitalist system is that it can be sold. It can be alienated. Now, there are a lot of when I use the term alienated, that's effectively the same thing as being sold. That's what that means. It's a term that economists and social scientists use to designate this characteristic feature of being able to be, you know, sold, given away, bequeathed to somebody else, and so forth. Now, why do I stress that? I mean, everybody knows property is something that gets sold. Well, not always. There are many societies where where there's certain kinds of property you cannot sell, because it belongs to people collectively. For example, sometimes it's very difficult to sell land because you've got multiple people who have title to parts of that land, right? So it's very hard to parcel it out. But in the case of capitalism, property is something that can be alienated or sold, and thus is not tied to the owner in the same way that some other forms of property are. That's one of the reasons it's called chattel slavery. Chattel. Chattel means property that can be bought and sold. In many pre-capitalist societies, as I just said, there are forms of property that can't be sold and must, for example, stay in the family, can't be alienated. Well, we can see the workings of chattel slavery and the use of the enslaved as property in a number of documents in this chapter. The one that really is striking is document 11, and I would encourage you to look at this. Again, it's a long document, but all it is a listing of the names of 272 African American enslaved men and women and children who were owned by Georgetown College, which now is Georgetown University. It's just on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. It's a suburb of Washington, D.C. now, the area where Georgetown College is located. But at the time, it was a kind of rural area. Washington, D.C. was not nearly that large. And there's this bill of sale where the president of Georgetown College sells 272 African American women, men, and children um, to two slave traders in the internal slave trade. One of them was named Jesse Beatty, and the other was Henry Johnson. And these two men were slave traders who were buying slaves in Virginia and Maryland and then taking them to plantations, to slave labor camps in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas. These two men take this group to Alabama and Louisiana. For a brief description of the internal slave trade, you can see classified advertisements in document 12 that are in Washington D.C. newspapers. At any rate, the 272 slaves sold by Georgetown College in this document uh, were sold for $115,000, which, if we look at the value of $115,000 today, and then calculate a slight bit of interest, we're looking at about $1.5 billion in value in today's terms. Just a little under 1.5 billion. The reason I say that is that if you look at Georgetown University today and look at its endowment, an endowment is a sum of wealth that's used to help do things like pay for scholarships, and the like. But that endowment is basically founded by and established by the sale of these 272 enslaved men, women, and children. I talked about this in the earliest lecture, the first lecture, where I made the point that my son went to Georgetown, and one of the main reasons my son could go to Georgetown and get scholarships from Georgetown was from that endowment. Well, this sum of money, this $115,000, made it possible for Georgetown to create a scholarship fund that would allow young white men to go to the university tuition free. It also kept Georgetown from going bankrupt and going belly up. And so this is just one of the ways where you see slaves being used as property. In the census, we just have a measure of the property value of the enslaved, the total value of the enslaved. In the Texas documents, we have other measures of their values as property, right? So um, that's one way of thinking about it. Now I want us to think a little bit about the ways in which enslaved were also vital sources of capital. We can think of them as property, something that can be bought and sold, and something that one can gain, income from. But I want us to think about them in a way as the creators of land and purchasing land and acquiring financial capital. Now, capital is a term, is a concept that I'm sure you've seen before, you have run across, but let's define it very closely here so we understand what capital means. Capital, when economists speak of capital, they speak of assets that can enhance one's power to perform economically useful work. Capital is an asset that can enhance one's power to perform economically useful work. In other words, capital is wealth that creates further wealth. In a capitalist society, capital is usually identified with equipment, let's say factory machinery, factory buildings. It's often associated with financial capital, with technology, and it's the foundation of any economy's growth. We usually think of slaves as labor. You need to stop thinking of slaves as labor. They're capital. In short, they create wealth not just by their labor, but as property. So let's think about how this is done. And there's a document which is, I'm sure, quite difficult for you to, when you were reading this document, if you've looked at it, my suspicion is that it was very difficult to understand what exactly is happening here, what's going on here. And that document is a document that comes from a study that was done by a woman by the name of Bonnie Martin. She's a historian, and she studied equity mortgages or mortgages in Virginia and Louisiana. She's also studied in South Carolina, but I didn't include that material in this chart because it was too much. So here's a chart. That's not the right chart. Let's see if I can find it. Here it is. This is a chart that identifies the equity mortgages in Virginia and Louisiana that were acquired in first before 1776 in Virginia, and then between 1812 and 1860 in, and she just looked at 6 counties: Culpeper, Albemarle, Goochland, Halifax, and Lunenburg counties. Just looked at those counties and looked at mortgage documents. Now, what is a mortgage? A mortgage is um, when you buy land, you often have to put up some kind of collateral, and you are borrowing money from a bank or from some other uh, figures. Churches were really important sources of mortgages, and you are borrowing money from a bank or from a church or from somebody you know, um, and uh, and you then pay that back over time. I have a mortgage on my house. Actually, I don't. I just paid off the mortgage on a house after 20 years of living in it. But I borrowed money from the bank in order to purchase this house, and the collateral for the house actually was not was no, I had no collateral. I owned nothing when I bought the house of any value. Um, uh, the collateral was the house itself. If I could not pay the mortgage back, then I would lose the house, and I would lose everything that I had paid into it up to that point. In this case here, these are mortgages on land that's purchased by Virginians, and then in two different counties in Louisiana. A parish is the same thing as a county. Opelousas and Baton Rouge Parish in Louisiana. She studies effectively 6 counties, and that's it here. What did she find? What she noted was that before 1776, in these counties in Virginia, uh, there were. She has a total of, let's see, how many mortgages? 400 and 449 mortgages. 449 mortgages. And what she observed was that the 449 mortgages, there were 257 mortgages where plantation owners or farmers bought land or borrowed money to buy land, uh, but they didn't back it by slave collateral. They didn't put up their slaves as collateral to pay to acquire that loan. So there were 257 of them, and there were, by comparison, only 192 of those mortgages acquired before 1776, in which slaves were held as collateral, were put up as collateral. So let's just be clear we understand what we're talking about here. If you put up your slaves as collateral to buy land and to borrow money to buy land, that if you are unable to pay the mortgage back, then your slaves will be repossessed. Well, they'll be taken from you, not necessarily repossessed. They will go to the bank. And so in this case here, there's a pretty significant number, and I think I've got these numbers switched around. It should be 32% and 57%. 57% of the mortgages before 1776 were not backed by slaves. 192 were. Now, this is the number that I want you to pay particular attention to. Even though there were fewer mortgages that were backed by slaves, there was way more value of land that was acquired in those slave-backed mortgages. Hopefully you're following this. I don't know that this is necessarily easy to understand, but even though only 32%, and sorry, I got this flipped around, I've got to fix that somehow, but even though there are only 32% of the mortgages were backed by slaves, that represented almost 70% of the total value of land that was purchased in Virginia before 1776 in those 6 counties. And the value in 2015 dollars would be about $42 million. Now, what Martin then observed was in the period 1812 to 1860, there were many, many more mortgages that were not backed by slaves. So in Virginia and Maryland, they started to slow down their use of slave-backed mortgages, in this period of the early 19th century. Now, why is that? And I'll come back and answer that question in a second. But I want you to notice that about 28% of mortgages in Virginia between 1812 and 1860 were backed by slaves, in which the person who purchased the mortgage put up their slaves as collateral, and the value of total land purchased with slaves as collateral also diminished. So let's answer the question I just posed: why is there a decrease in the reliance on slave-backed mortgages in Virginia from 1776 to 1812 to 1860? And the answer to that is simply that most of the land has already been purchased in Virginia. Virginia is well, uh, there wasn't as much expansion in Virginia after 1776. And the other factor is that so in short, if you're going to buy land, you would often put up your own land as collateral, or other land that you already own as collateral. The other factor is that slaves were more valuable in Virginia to be as property to be sold to other states. And so it's in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina that for the most of the 19th century, uh, plantation owners are selling their slaves to slave traders, like we saw in the case of Georgetown, who are taking those enslaved people and transporting them to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Arkansas, and states further west where cotton is booming. Now that if we look at Louisiana, we see the reverse of that. In Louisiana, and oh shoot, this didn't come through. Let me see if I'll have to explain, have to describe this. This slide did not all get saved onto on the last row is not showing. Anyhow, what you notice before 1776 is about 49% of mortgages were not backed by slaves compared to 51%. And then in 1812 to 1860, it shifts from 47% to 53%. So 53% of all mortgages in Louisiana in these two counties were backed by slave mortgages. Now, the comparison, though, and I'll have to just read it to you or give it to you, but if you look at the comparison between the value of those mortgages in 1812 to 1860, only about 12% of the total value of wealth acquired with through mortgages, or land acquired through mortgages, about 12% of the value of that land was backed by slave-based mortgages. By comparison, 88%, just do the math, 88% of the mortgages backed by slaves, or 88% of the value of all land purchased was purchased with slave-backed mortgages, for about $2.5 million, about $121 billion in today's, or in 2015 terms. Now, what I'm trying to point out is that, and just so we're clear, and this is, I think, the point that I'm trying to make sure and make, when a landowner put up a slave as collateral, they borrowed from a bank to buy land. And on that land, the enslaved men and women were used as collateral. But they also worked that land. They cleared it, they planted it, they hoed it, they weeded it, they harvested the cotton or the other crops. They then they would and the cotton and other crops were sold to pay back the mortgage and to pay the interest on the loan. So when the debt was paid off, the landowner and his or her family now owned the property outright. It increased their wealth in terms of the amount of land that they owned, but they had done so entirely with this on the bodies of their slaves. Their slaves were first collateral, which allowed them to get the loan, and then they were labor, which allowed them to pay back the loan. And so this is why I say that these are that slaves as capital really made it possible for many white Southerners to purchase land, particularly the largest landowners. So let's look at a document where you can see this in action, and where you can also see the way in which slave-backed mortgages then helped create banks. this is a fascinating document, and that's not it. This is document 8 in your reader. And this is a very difficult document to explain to undergraduate students. I often find this difficult, but let's give it a try. So what's happening in this document? Slacks, Eliphalet Slack and his wife, Mistress Abigail Cutter Slack, they have come before a notary and they have signed a contract. And the contract is basically here. This said Eliphalet Slack, having subscribed for 426 shares of stock of $100 each, forming altogether the sum of $42,600 of capital stock of the Citizens Bank of Louisiana, created and incorporated by the legislature of the state of Louisiana, approved the first day of April in the year 1833. So this is a bank that's been around since 1833, and Eliphalet and Abigail Cutter Slack are buying 426 shares of stock in the bank. Each one of those shares of stock is worth $100 or costs $100. So they have bought $42,600 of stock in Citizens Bank of Louisiana. Now, when we say capital stock is the stock that allows the bank to first be chartered and allows the bank to continue. We usually think of banks as some place where you put money. I take my savings to the bank. I create a savings account or a checking account, and then I have access to that money. In this case here, these people are now part owners of this bank. They have subscribed to capital stock, which makes them part owners of this particular bank. Part of this will be used to found this bank, and as the bank makes profit, how this will work, as the bank makes a profit, then the Slacks will get a share of that profit in the form of a dividend check. Now, when banks, so how does a bank make a profit? The bank takes in deposits from its customers, and then it loans money to other customers. And when a bank loans money, they actually loan much more than what they have at any given time in the bank vault. They loan much more than they have in shares of capital stock. And so what the Slacks are doing when they purchase this capital stock, what they are doing is they are helping to create the money supply in this part of Louisiana. They are backing that money supply. Now, what is going on here? They still own their slaves. They still have land in their possession. And I think there is, there is still land in that they have in possession. Let's see if I can. Nope, that isn't it. But it's what they're doing here is that they are basically owning shares of stock in this bank, and they're using their slaves, and there's some land that's being mortgaged as well, which I included in the contract, but I haven't included it here. They're using that to finance their purchase of these shares of stock. They're not putting up their own money. They're putting up their collateral to buy a share of stock. And then how are they going to then pay off the value of the mortgage that they have done to purchase these shares of stock? Well, the enslaved men that work on their farm or their plantation, and the enslaved men and women, they are going to produce cotton or sugar or some other crop, and that is going to be sold, which will allow the Slacks to then pay back the loan that they have really received from the bank in order for them to buy these shares of capital stock. Now, I hope that hasn't been more confusing than it is. Go look at that document and see if you can sort it out. And I'll try to come back to it in another fashion on Friday and see if we can look at this again in a different way. So the bank is going to provide loans to others. The bank will also issue money. And this is a time when there was no national bank. There's no national currency. Most money was locally printed, locally backed with local commodities and with the enslaved. For example, in Louisiana, the largest bank in Louisiana was founded with $8 million in capital stock. $7 million of that capital stock was money that was based on slave-backed mortgages. It was the value of the slaves that allowed them to borrow money and create the First Bank of Louisiana is what it was called, First Bank of Louisiana. Now you can kind of see this in a document which is the one of the which I want to show you here. This particular document. This is document 21, and in it I just took a screenshot of a $1 bill from the state of Florida. And what you can see is that they kind of subtly acknowledge the fact that this money, this $1 bill, or the money that's produced by this Florida bank, is backed by the value of the enslaved and their production of cotton. That's what makes this money, that's what makes it possible to print this money. That's what it's based upon. Often people think, well, money is based upon a certain amount of gold. That's the key factor here. Yeah. In the South in the 19th century, it was backed almost entirely by the labor and the bodies of the enslaved. And that's the point that I'm trying to make here. This is a monetary system, a financial system, a banking system, a land ownership system that was dependent upon the bodies of the slaves and the labor of the slaves producing cotton or sugar or any number of other commodities. And it's not just the American banking system that's dependent upon it. Most of the banks in the South, they would establish themselves using local um, land and local slaves as the foundation of the wealth that was used to purchase or to acquire capital stock. And then what the bank would do is it would try to sell the capital stock on the open market in Wall Street or in New York. And so the Wall Street bankers would come along and they would say, all right, we'll buy, I don't know, 1,000 shares of stock or 1,000,000 shares of stock in a Southern bank, and those 1,000,000 shares of stock were basically acquired on the mortgages of enslaved men and women, and so Wall Street is tied into it. The local banks are tied into it. Local landowners are tied into it. They have mortgaged their slaves and used the mortgages they acquired on their slaves to buy land or to buy capital stock in banks. And that capital stock in banks allows the monetary system to function in the South. So just about every aspect of the Southern um, financial system, financial sector, and land-based system were tied into the purchase of and the mortgaging of the enslaved. Now, that's just one example of a way in which the South's system was dependent upon slaves as capital. I want to look at some other areas, other industries that were benefiting from slavery. And one of the major industries that benefited from slavery was the insurance industry. These slaves were valuable. Hopefully, I've made that clear. It's not just labor. It's not just unpaid labor that was at root here. This was the most important value, the most important property that slave owners possessed. And if you and I, have something that's valuable to us, we will insure it. We have insurance on a house. We have insurance on a car. As the car becomes less and less valuable to us, we might be less and less concerned with it. But if it's our most important property, we're going to insure it for sure. And you see it here in document 16, which is an insurance policy on one young slave, a woman by the name of Judy, and it was a policy that was sold by Richmond Fire Association. That's the name of the insurance company. And you can see here a little bit about how the value of this enslaved person was measured. So the Richmond Fire Association, in the consideration of the sum of $6.48 to them in hand, paid by Henry Curtis of Hanover County, Virginia. Henry Curtis has paid the Richmond Fire Association $6.48. That's his premium. That's the price of his insurance. And this is the policy then. Richmond Fire Association insures the life of Judy, a slave in the county of Hanover, state of Virginia, in the amount of $400. So they basically valued Judy at $400. This is in 1853. We don't know. I don't know how old Judy is, but my suspicion is that Judy is not a. This is not a very high price in terms of value of, of an enslaved person at that point in time. But it's about half. Um, it's not even close to average. And so the term of the insurance is for 1 year. So if she dies in the coming year, then the insurance company will pay Henry Curtis $400. And they then lay out the time frame from the 15th day of August 1853 until the 15th day of August 1854. So over the course of the next year, your purchase of that insurance policy for $6.48, Henry Curtis will allow us to insure your slave Judy for the value of $400. And this is another part of that policy. Now, what I find fascinating in this policy is another little piece of information. It lays out the reasons why they wouldn't pay it. Right? If she dies, if Judy dies by a number of different causes, then the insurance company will not be liable. They won't have to pay Henry Curtis the $400 that he thinks he deserves here. That his insurance policy makes clear he does deserve. So, if the said slave shall commit suicide, or shall die by any means of an invasion, insurrection, riot, or civil commotion, or of any military or usurped power, or if she dies by the hand of justice, she's executed, this policy shall be void, null, and of no effect. Here we have an insurance company offering an insurance plan or insurance policy on this life of this slave. And my suspicion is that almost all slaves would have had some kind of insurance policy on them. And this is a $6.48 every year, more or less, that would be paid by Henry Curtis for this enslaved that he had on his plantation. And this is a kind of standard insurance policy. So what's my point here? My point is that insurance companies are making fortunes off of this, right? And they're not the only ones. There are many other industries that are making fortunes. Now, in this particular case, document 16 was Richmond, Virginia insurance company. But there were many other insurance companies that were owned by people from around the country. There were other insurance companies. And finally, I want us to just point out that it's not just Southern businesses and Southern banks and Southern insurance companies, but just about every Northern institution is tied in with this. And this is a speech from a Presbyterian minister who was unhappy in 1853 that a Northern church members of the Presbyterian Church were criticizing slavery, and so he is disgruntled at a series of questions that they asked. You can read this. And these questions implied that Southern churchgoers were in the wrong on the issue of slavery. So he asked a couple of questions of Northern church members that I think are fascinating. And what he's trying to do is show how intertwined Northern church members were, Northern businesses, Northern families were in ownership of slaves, even though they may not own them themselves. And so he points out the number of slaveholders in connection with churches and the number of slaves held by them. These are the questions that are being asked of the Southern churches, right? And he rejects that. And then he says, all right, so let me ask you this. What's the number of Northern church members concerned directly or indirectly in building and fitting out ships for the African slave trade? How many of you made your wealth, made your fortune in the slave trade, either putting together and loaning money, buying stock in companies that were involved in the slave trade? He then asked, what's the number of Northern church members who traffic with slaveholders and are seeking to make money by selling them Negro clothing, handcuffs, and cowhides? Cowhides would have been used for whips. Handcuffs were used to hold them fast as they were transported southward towards from Virginia and Maryland to Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and points westward. Right. The Negro clothing. These were cheap. This was cheap cotton cloth. Many of the textile mills in the North made their fortunes selling cheap clothing to Southern slave owners. He then asked, what's the number of Northern church members who have sent orders to New Orleans and other Southern cities to have slaves sold to pay debts owing them from the South? All right, just to give you an example, let's say I am a bank. I have bank stock, or I have money in a bank that has loaned money to Southerners, and those Southerners have put up their slaves as collateral, and now they can't pay their debts. He's asking, how many of you have ordered New Orleans? That's sort of the financial capital of the South. How many of you sent orders to New Orleans or someplace else in the South to insist that those slaves be sold so that your debts get paid? The number of Northern, he cites Uncle Tom's Cabin here because this is one of the reasons why a family's broken apart in Uncle Tom's Cabin is because a Northerner who had a loan, who'd given money to a Southerner, and the Southerner had put the slave up as collateral. He sells them. Then asks the question, what's the number of church members who buy cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, oranges, pineapples, figs, ginger, cocoa, melons, and 1,000 other things raised by slave labor? You think your hands are clean. Your hands are not clean. You are purchasing all these things. He then asks, what's the number of church members who have intermarried with slaveholders and have thus become slave owners themselves? There was a lot of intermarriage between Northerners and Southerners. What happens if you have a daughter that you marry to a plantation owner, or you have a spouse who is a plantation owner, and you end up owning enslaved people, or enjoy the wealth made by the blood of the slave? It's the number of Northern church members who are descendants of the men who kidnapped Negroes in Africa and brought them to Virginia and New England in former years. Remember that the Rhode Islanders, the Massachusetts ship captains, many of them were involved, and they weren't directly kidnapping the enslaved in Africa. As we pointed out, it's mostly Africans who are doing that, but they were acquiring them on the coast, and then they bring them to Virginia or they bring them to New England. We're talking about in the 18th century. How many of you are descendants from them? Then ask, what's the aggregate and individual wealth of members who descended from those folks? Are you giving up your money? Are you giving up your blood-stained gold, he says? The number of Northern church members, ministers especially, who have advocated murder and resistance to the law of the land. He's criticizing them for helping enslaved escape, etc. And what he's effectively doing here is he's saying, look, you are getting rich off of the slave trade. You're getting rich off of the commodities that the slaves are producing, and you're married to slave owners and so forth and so on. Right. So what you see here is a very sharp criticism of the Southern. You see a very sharp criticism made by a Southerner of the Northerners who are saying, "Look, our hands are clean. We don't own slaves." And he's saying, "Look closely. You're definitely all, you're just as your hands are just as dirty as ours. If you think this is an unjust and immoral system, then you also need to pay the price to put an end to it. You can't just be, saying, oh, you Southerners, look at what you're doing. Look at the horrible things you do to the enslaved people." Banks, insurance companies, uh, uh, clothing companies, textile mills, they were all tied into this system. And that's the point that I'm trying to get across here. We'll come back and look at some of these other aspects of this, but go through and read those documents carefully and see if you can make some sense out of and draw the evidence out that explains how the North and the South were implicated in financially, in land ownership, and in the production of American wealth, how that was so dependent upon the role of the enslaved and the misery of the enslaved in the 19th century. And I will stop with that and post it here in a second.